On the day of this upload 4 years ago, Kirby and the Forgotten Land released on the Switch and became the most successful title in the series by a wide margin. While the whole internet is currently going insane over 3D Mario, it seems many players outside the Kirby community haven't fully realized that there hasn't been a major mainline Kirby release in 4 years, because by all expectations the next 3D Kirby entry should have released today. Despite the fact that we haven't seen a new proper 3D Mario in 7.5 years, there's at least a clear reason why. Bowser's Fury served as a stepping stone during the Switch era, and Donkey Kong Bonanza helped fill the gap from the same software department. For Kirby, however, this 4-year absence is suspicious, especially considering how consistently the franchise has historically released mainline entries in the last decade. Return to Dreamland marked the series' return to home consoles after the troubled GameCube period. It released in October 2011 to a respectable success, which is why Triple Deluxe followed not long after January 2014, roughly 2 years later. Planet Robobot arrived in April 2016, with Star Allies closing the cycle in March 2018, not even 2 full years after Planet Robobot, in spite of having to create HD assets. Since Return to Dreamland on the Wii, the franchise established a remarkably consistent release schedule of 2-year intervals. HAL was able to maintain this pace because all of these games share the same engine, art style and core gameplay, and most of them weren't even HD projects. For many IPs, that kind of output might sound like a repetitive treadmill prioritizing quantity over quality. Yet despite their similarities, at least 3 of these titles are widely regarded as high-quality entries, speaking to HAL's ability to develop games efficiently while still maintaining a strong standard. Star Allies was the first one that felt rushed, unfinished and ultimately unworthy of being Kirby's first proper HD mainline entrance, especially after genre-defining releases like Mario Odyssey or Breath of the Wild had arrived shortly before. It simply wasn't feasible to develop a brand new HD home console game in less than 2 years after Planet Robobot, while still meeting the expectations that game had set. It was time for a new level of ambition. The Forgotten Land released almost exactly 4 years after Star Allies, making it the longest development cycle for a Kirby game since Return to Dreamland. Taking production logistics into account, the game didn't even spend the full 4 years in active development. A more realistic estimate would be around 3 to 3.5 years. That's once again remarkably efficient, considering the team had to build a functional 3D engine, translate Kirby's traditional 2D gameplay into fully 3-dimensional space, adjust to the pandemic and still deliver a result that feels almost flawless. So why am I boring you with this? Because this short development history is what makes the absence of the next mainline title right now so incredibly curious and promising altogether. The Forgotten Land didn't receive immediate DLC, nor was it incomplete. It launched as a fully realized package with no need for post-launch updates to finish the experience later, unlike Star Allies. Considering the game was most likely already complete by the end of 2021, we can reasonably assume that the next mainline entry has been in development for at least 4 years by now. We can also safely assume it will be another 3D game. The Forgotten Land had by far the biggest impact on the series in years, and it would be unwise to return to a dimension that some players might perceive as less ambitious. Of course, 3D games are more complex than 2D titles, and naturally take longer to develop, but roughly 4 years is comparable to the time Nintendo took between Super Mario 3D World and Mario Odyssey, or between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild. That said, all 3 games are developed under very different budgets, resources and circumstances. According to Aonuma, Breath of the Wild's development team consisted of around 300 people, at least 100 more than what teams working on Mario or Kirby typically have. Mario Odyssey, however, is a more fitting comparison to the Forgotten Land, though it's still a much larger experience overall. Both Breath of the Wild and Odyssey are considered some of the biggest entries in their respective franchises, and if 4 years is the minimum development time for a game of such a scale, that's already quite long for a Kirby title, which is genuinely seen as more often AA franchise. The interesting part is that the next mainline Kirby game hasn't just been in development for 4 years. It may have been in development even longer, since it still wasn't even announced. In other words, it has likely enjoyed a production value normally reserved for AAA projects. Naturally, the game could have been finished, with Nintendo simply waiting for the right release window. It doesn't necessarily mean the developers needed all this time to complete it. They may also want to space out releases more carefully, especially since Starcrossed World and Air Riders already filled much of 2025. But even if we assume a maximum of 4 years of development, that's still unusually long for Kirby. It's particularly curious because you would expect development to take less time this round. After all, the team has now experience building a 3D Kirby game, along with a foundation of assets and systems that could be quietly reused reused. So what is taking so long? The Forgotten Land essentially served as another fresh starting point, much like Return to Dreamland once did. It would have been an easy success to follow it up with the equivalent of another triple deluxe, a safe sequel with just enough additions to justify a new entry. Only few would have seriously complained, and the Switch could have received one last mainline encore. In 2021, HAL hyped up the then unannounced Forgotten Land as Kirby's next phase, and even expressed their ambition to create the pinnacle of Kirby games. Of course, studios can't always praise every upcoming project in the same way, but the only recent trace we can point to is a hiring wave in January 2024, where HAL was looking to fill a variety of positions. It's unclear which Kirby project these roles were meant for, and the hiring could simply have been a countermeasure to offset the loss of their partner studio Vanpool in 2023. But it seems the developers are aiming for something more ambitious this time. Instead of settling into another decade of low-risk follow-ups, the unusually long development time suggests a far more demanding sequel, one that doesn't simply reuse the foundation built by the Forgotten Land. What I'm talking about isn't just another 3D action game with linear stages, but the two dreaded words that might tank my watch time right now, earn me a wave of thumbs down and a disinheritance from my family: open world. The breadth of the wildification on some recent Nintendo titles has left a rather sour taste, to say the least. It sometimes feels as if Nintendo's trying to replicate Zelda's success without fully recognizing that what worked for Zelda doesn't necessarily apply to every other property. In the case of Metroid Prime 4, the developers openly mentioned Breath of the Wild as an influence, and it's likely no coincidence that Mario Kart World took such an open direction when work began shortly after Breath of the Wild released to massive success. I do think a series like Mario Kart can work in an open world format, but creators often approach the idea too cautiously. Instead of fully exploring how each franchise could use its own strengths within open environments, they either tend to play it plain and safe or add an open world because it sounds thrilling on advertisement for easy to impress casuals. Kirby has always placed a stronger emphasis on exploration rather than pure platforming. The very first Dreamland already featured branching paths in multiple ways forward, at a time when most Game Boy platformers were relatively straightforward and linear in their progression. This trend runs throughout the entire franchise, and you can always find examples of Kirby prioritizing exploration as an underlying gameplay hook. Superstar features an entire mode dedicated to gathering treasures in an interconnected cave. Multiple Kirby games require you to reach 100% completion to face the true final boss. Amazing Mirror is, at its core, essentially an open world game with a seamless map and no level select screen, and the final world in Star Allies allows its levels to be played in any order. Even the Forgotten Land, with its linear 3D stages, hides so many clever secrets that aren't required for collectibles or 100% completion, but simply reward players for exploring the levels more thoroughly. I've always had the impression that HAL would like to create a more open Kirby game, but might be held back by limited resources, budget constraints, and the concern of drifting too far from the series' core identity, of being accessible to absolute beginners with relatively simple gameplay. With the Forgotten Land, however, everything changed. Its success gave the franchise more prestige and likely a larger budget for a successor. It also trained the audience to expect Kirby in 3D, while Nintendo games are often designed with newcomers in mind. It shouldn't be underestimated how much of the player base consists of returning fans, especially in a series with over 40 titles. Assuming that newcomers would struggle with a more open style of Kirby is plausible, but it can also become creatively limiting. The Forgotten Land brought a large number of fans into the franchise who may now be interested in a more open approach. It could also attract players who previously dismissed Kirby as too simplistic, as a more open 3D Kirby game could serve as an appealing alternative for all those desperate 3D Mario fans. Even so, it's not like they have to create Kirby Skyrim Edition. When I talk about an open world Kirby, I don't actually expect the next mainline entry to be open world in the same way as Zelda. I do think that might happen eventually, but it could be too big of a leap right now, especially since the Forgotten Land only just cracked a can of possibilities worth exploring first. What I'm imagining is something closer to Super Mario 64, Sunshine or Odyssey, sandbox-style levels with wide but still limited spaces. The next step in guiding beginners towards becoming more experienced players might simply be asking them to take control of the right stick and move the camera themselves. Something that feels completely natural to us sweaty nerds can actually be a genuine challenge for someone whose most serious gaming experience was playing The Sims on a DS. Of course, my bias towards sandbox collectathons might be showing here, but I genuinely think Kirby would work wonderfully in that kind of environment. And since the Forgotten Land was a relatively cautious toe dip into 3D gameplay, it wouldn't be surprising if HAL took another gradual step forward here as well. For Kirby, it's rarely a matter of choosing one extreme or the other. A mix of linear and more open 3D sections could easily work, loosening the strict structure of the Forgotten Land stages while creating a stronger sense of connectivity between larger areas. Many games already experimented with this balance, locking the camera during certain moments to create tighter, more focused challenges while leaving room for open exploration elsewhere. I also don't want to downplay the strengths of tightly designed linear 3D levels. One of the reasons the Forgotten Land looks in certain moments even better than many AAA Nintendo titles is because the camera is always directed from a specific perspective, allowing the visual team to focus everything on a carefully composed shot. It's the same reason Luigi's Mansion 3 looks so gorgeous, and it highlights one of the major benefits of this design approach. And before Kirby turns into yet another piece of open world slop, I would gladly take a well-balanced Forgotten Land successor instead. However, with Air Riders they have already started checking off one pillar of my personal trinity of dream Kirby games. While I may have to wait longer for an amazing Mirror remake or sequel, I still have to believe that a collectathon style 3D Kirby could happen if the opportunity presents itself. Artificially hyping up a game because of imaginary reasons YouTubers try to sell you is never a good reason to expect the world. This video is meant more to highlight the unusually long development time and its plausible implications. Of course there could always be trouble behind the scenes, but I have no reason to assume that given the franchise's excellent track record over the last decade and its spot-on transition to 3D with the Forgotten Land. If the next game turns out to be a relatively unspectacular but still convincing Forgotten Land successor, I'll take it. If it's a risky experiment for something no one specifically asked for, I appreciate it. Based on its recent releases, the franchise gives me no reason to worry about any upcoming title, and I'm always open to innovative ideas I never knew I wanted. So by all means, try a first-person shooter Kirby platformer. It wouldn't be the first time a game has done that.
You are almost there, Kirby. I wish I could have welcomed you to my home under different circumstances. You are almost there, Kirby. For now, it's more like a Forgotten Land. Kirby, try pressing the L button. It activates my yellow vision, which highlights interactable objects. You made it! Kirby, you can go anywhere you like from here. Just let me know if you run into any problems. Hold on, Kirby. That area looks dangerous. Might as well check the other path for now. You are almost... Hold on, Kirby. That area looks dangerous. Might as well check the other path.
Yeah!